One of the biggest narratives during Trump's first few months has been his tariff policy. Early on in his second term, he enacted tariffs on specific nations and products, but as we saw at the beginning of April, this dramatically escalated when Trump's Liberation Day saw him place sweeping tariffs on over 180 countries. As we now know, a few days after this, Trump did pull back many of these tariffs, but he has restarted and maintained an escalatory tariff war with China. If any trade relationship is going to have a global impact, if it's disrupted, then it's going to be the US-China relationship. Even though Trump pulled back most of his initial tariffs from Liberation Day, we can still take some lessons from his initial tariff onslaught. What does history teach us about Trump and his relationship to tariffs? Who was hit the hardest by his initial Liberation Day tariffs, and what is his overarching aim here? Let's dive in. As we enter into a world where power is one of the greatest commodities, Trump seeks to use his power through the implementation of his favourite tool, which is the tariff. Today, I'll discuss Trump's trade policy, his efforts to reindustrialise, and his America First stance. I'll also delve into how he has used tariffs and who against as he pursues a strategy of economic statecraft to draw other nations to the negotiating table with the overall aim of getting what he wants. Trump first confessed his love for tariffs in the 1980s. He also proposed his belief that the world should pay for American security back in the 1980s, which he is also pursuing today. He has been remarkably consistent with the fact that he's been saying this for 4 decades. We also have his first presidency that we can look back at, when he also entered into a trade war with China. So, what else can we expect from this latest chapter in history? If we zoom out, the grand strategy aim here is that Trump is in pursuit of an America First policy, and tariffs are his right-hand man. This brings us to what a tariff is. A tariff is an additional charge on imports that is paid by the nation that implements it. So, a tariff will raise the costs for American businesses to buy goods from abroad. This could then raise prices for consumers, as businesses will seek to protect their profit margins and push any further disruptions down the supply chain. Another thing that Trump wants is to reindustrialise America and to protect American jobs. However, this takes time. If an American t-shirt seller is suddenly slapped with a massive tariff to import goods or raw materials, they will have the choice of either taking that cost, which will eat into their profits, or they'll have to find alternative suppliers within the United States. This is an example of a sector where the United States has hardly any footprint, and it's here where businesses and then consumers will shoulder the highest costs. Eventually, this could lead to American reindustrialization, but this won't occur overnight and not without deep pain for many of these industries. Now, Trump is typically a man who has also opposed the age of globalization. In the past, he has frequently criticised some of the key features of globalization, such as the NAFTA agreement and the World Trade Organization. As a result of his views, and with him back in the White House for a second term, we've seen big shifts to global trade. Since his inauguration in January, what actions has Trump taken on the tariff front to get us to where we are today? Since entering office, we have seen Trump enforce and utilise tariffs multiple times as a negotiating tool. When Colombia refused to take a plane of deportees from the United States, Trump placed 25% tariffs on them. These were rescinded not long after that, once the Colombians accepted the plane. Trump has also had spats with Canada and Mexico over the border crisis and the fentanyl issue. At first threatening 25% tariffs on both, before finally getting what he wanted and delaying them for a month. He then eventually put the tariffs on Canada and Mexico anyway, who are two of the United States. biggest trade partners. Another victim of Trump's tariff regime has been China, who has also promised to enact reciprocal tariffs on any tariffs that the US places on China. Trump has placed tariffs on Venezuelan oil and has also threatened Russia with tariffs if they don't agree to a ceasefire deal in Ukraine. It seems that when Trump is uncertain, his mind immediately goes to tariffs and how he could potentially use them as a negotiating tool. When it comes to products that Trump has added tariffs on, he's added a 25% tariff on steel and aluminium imports, and a 25% tariff on all foreign-made cars is expected at a later date. Semiconductor tariffs have also been confirmed to be coming in the next few months. But all of these tariffs occurred before Trump's Liberation Day on April 2nd, when he unveiled his largest tariff package ever. Unfortunately for Donald, it seems that the only thing that he set free was the stock market, as it plummeted over the next few days. Let's dive into what Liberation Day looked like and what initial takeaways we can take from its implementation. Before we dive into the specifics of tariffs, it's worth considering who such tariffs would impact the most. Since tariffs are charged on imports, it's worth noting where the United States imports from the most. The biggest importer into the United States is the collective European Union, with around 18.6%. This is followed by Mexico with 15%, Canada with 13%, China also with 13%, Japan with 4%, South Korea with 3%, Vietnam with 3%, Taiwan with 2.7%, India with 2.7%, and Thailand with 1.8%. So from that list, it's going to be trade with these nations where the biggest impact will be felt by American importers. So with this in mind, the tariffs that have been enacted upon these nations are as follows. The EU has a 20% tariff. An initial 34% tariff was placed on Chinese imports, but as I'll discuss over the coming weeks, we have seen this rise substantially. Mexico and Canada were excluded from the Liberation Day tariffs due to the previous tariffs that had been enacted on them. Vietnam had a 46% tariff placed on it, Thailand 36%, Taiwan 32%, India 26%, South Korea 25%, and Japan 24%. Of the list of the top US importers, none are below a 20% tariff. When 10% across the board tariffs were given to some nations, these are steep tariffs on some of the US's biggest trade partners. American businesses would hence see a large increase in the cost to import from these nations. The Liberation Day tariffs also had economic and recession impacts, with many economists stating that the chance of a recession in the US had risen from 40% to 60%, and that this likely wouldn't be without adverse effects for the rest of the world. Since the US economy is around a quarter of the global economy in nominal terms, it does make sense that any negative impacts in the United States would naturally have ripple effects around the rest of the world. Trump's tariffs aren't only realigning the world of global trade and finance, but they're also leading to geopolitical alliances between nations that don't typically align. China, Japan, and South Korea have announced plans to respond to Trump's trade policies together, whereas typically in the past, the United States has aligned with South Korea and Japan against Chinese influence in the Indo-Pacific. We've also seen phone calls between the EU and Chinese officials, which could lead to stronger trade connections down the line. In the capitalist developed world, people ultimately need things. Even if businesses do take on the higher tariff costs and physical supply chains aren't affected, there are further psychological effects here. Trust in the United States over the last few months has been dramatically falling, and hedges will be made against volatile United States foreign policy. Redrawing any trade connections that have been affected by tariffs won't occur immediately, but if the Americans are seeking to negatively affect nations around the world by reducing trade with them and enacting tariffs, I wouldn't be surprised if nations around the world looked elsewhere for trade and other close geopolitical relations and partnerships. With this idea in mind, it brings up the question of who is in a better position. Trump has painted himself as a strongman, but could his nation, in isolation, weather such tariffs and the storms that would occur as a consequence of them? What does the world need the United States for? And does Trump actually hold all the cards? Now, the United States is one of the largest consumer markets in the world. Before Trump's latest tariff episode, the United States acted as a final buyer of goods, especially from export-led economies such as China, Vietnam, and Mexico, which has contributed to the high US trade deficit. If this consumer demand suddenly fades due to higher import costs, then these manufacturing economies would be hurt. This could well be a purposeful strategy by the United States in its superpower geopolitical tussle with the Chinese. The Chinese are currently trying to pivot to a more consumer-based economy in light of their real estate struggles and stagnating consumer spending, which is leading to deflationary pressures. If the United States suddenly stopped bringing in imports from China, this would also have negative impacts on the Chinese economy. Another reason that the world needs the United States is the US dollar. This is another aspect that I will dive into over the coming weeks. Other reasons that the United States is so important to the world are innovation, capital flows, investment, and intellectual property, all of which place the United States close to the top of the financial food chain. Different parts of the world also rely on the United States for things outside of trade and finance. European security was backed by the United States before Trump arrived in office. It's now clear that they won't do this anymore, and Europe has to figure out its own security. The United States also ensures free navigation of global waterways, but as the signal leak implied, they want other nations, such as Egypt and the nations in the EU, to step up and take some of this effort. But bear in mind that not many nations have the capability of navigating the world's oceans as the US does, so enforcing such a ruling would be difficult, but that likely wouldn't stop the US from attempting to enforce such a ruling anyway. With all these threads in mind, there are so many strings that could shift due to the tariffs. It's clear that the United States has some very favourable cards, but in the superpower realm, China has extensive control over the world's periodic table and raw materials. One thing that we can't do is we can't foresee where this tariff story is going to go, but it is very worrying that the two biggest nations on the planet both have strategies that could seriously hurt the other. As the most important trade relationship in the world, this could have worrying consequences, and not just for China and the United States, but for the wider world. As we know with hindsight, many of the Liberation Day tariffs were paused, but the US-China trade war is currently on centre stage, and I believe it will remain there for some time. Today marks the start of a deep dive that I will undertake into Trump and his tariff policies. Over the coming weeks, I will discuss the famous equation that was used to formulate Trump's Liberation Day tariffs, and what occurred after Trump announced the 90-day pause. After this, I'll also explore the impacts that we've seen on the financial markets before exploring some longer-term issues such as the dollar as global reserve currency and the rise of an alternative Chinese-led global system. If these sound of interest, keep an eye out for any future podcast episodes, or head over to Substack where you will be able to find the posts over there. That's all for today. I've been Dylan. I'll talk to you next time.